Thanks everybody for joining in. We will get started in about a minute or two. Really appreciate you joining in for this event today.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on legal approaches to reduce gun violence, strategies from both Mexico and the United States. As many of you know, gun violence in Mexico has created an unprecedented and growing humanitarian crisis. Last year, there were more than 19,000 gun homicides in Mexico. A majority of these were likely committed with US-sourced firearms. On August 4th, the government of Mexico filed an unprecedented lawsuit against 11 US gun manufacturers and distributors, whom the Mexican government asserts are responsible for much of the violence that is occurring in Mexico today. We will hear today from a stellar panel, if I might say, of people who are extremely well informed about these issues. This particular event is being sponsored by 4 organizations: the Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas, which started last year; the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a grouping of experts who focus on firearms and other weapons trade around the world; the Giffords Law Center, which is a gun violence prevention organization; and Global Exchange, a human rights organization. So my name is John Lindsay Poland. I coordinate the Stop US Arms to Mexico project of Global Exchange. I'll be moderating today. I want to encourage any of you during the presentations. We will have hear from each of our panelists, and then we'll have significant time to respond to questions and have a discussion within the panel. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function within Zoom, or if you're on YouTube, you may be able to put comments there. We hope to gather these up. And then we'll respond to questions that you put in the Q&A box during the course of this hour. So we're joined today, like I said, by quite a group. And the first is Griel, who is a journalist and writer based in Mexico City. He specializes in crime and drugs and has focused on Latin America for 2 decades. His latest book, which addresses a lot of the same issues that we're going to be looking at today, and I highly recommend, is Blood, Gun, Money: How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. He's written 2 other books also on these issues, related issues: Gangster Warlords, Drug Dollars, Killing Fields, and the New Politics of Latin America, and El Narco: Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. We're also joined today by Steve Shadowin, who is a founding partner of Hillard and Shadowin, and specializes in economic justice and civil rights as an attorney. He's a lead attorney in the lawsuit filed by Mexico that we're going to be discussing today. And Steve represents the families of Mexican nationals killed by US Border Patrol agents along the US-Mexico border, having obtained the first ever ruling that Mexican nationals killed by US agents in Mexico can obtain judicial review of those killings in US courts. So welcome, Steve. We're also joined today by Kristen Rand, who I've known for many years and who is the legislative director for the Violence Policy Center and a leading expert on firearms regulation and product liability. And I would add, was also one of the pioneers in documenting much of the illegal arms flow from the United States into Mexico. She's authored and co-authored many reports. She's testified to Congress on gun violence prevention issues many times. And today she'll be talking about the marketing approach that is taken by the gun industry, which has been at the heart of additional legal cases and besides the Mexico lawsuit, and the impact of violence prevention approaches. I'll also be speaking briefly today. As I said, I coordinate the Stop US Arms to Mexico project, and I've written about, researched, organized action on human rights and US policy in Latin America for more than 30 years. So I also look at both the illegal flow as well as the legal trade of US sourced and other international firearms into Mexico. So I want to now turn it over to you, Jan, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you to all the organizers and the participants in the panel. So I arrived in Mexico from the UK in November 2000, just over 20 years ago. I'd first come to Latin America, interested often in the civil wars that were being fought in the 1980s, 1990s. And I realized that was what a generation of other journalists talked about. And I realized those had finished. And I arrived here, and one of the issues that grabbed my attention right away was this issue of drugs and drug lords and all this drug violence. And at the beginning, this seemed like a very exciting thing to be covering. But very quickly, as I started really seeing the reality of this, I realized it was a very brutal story and was going around, this is during the 2000s, 2004, 2005, going around these crime scenes, seeing these people who were murdered, seeing the effects on families. Now, I saw and witnessed during these years, this violence just escalate completely. And it suddenly went from this crime story to really, I found myself covering what seemed like an armed conflict, like the journalists before had covered back in the 80s and 90s, but something very different, something with very heavily armed groups, but that were very hidden in the shadows, suddenly coming out. And I saw, especially this really escalated in the Mexican government in 2006, put the full force of the military against the cartels. This only escalated further the conflict. So you started seeing crazy things that I was covering. I mean, there's battles with 500 gunmen from a cartel against 2,000 armed federal police, mass graves with close to 300 bodies. And you really saw deterioration and a stabilization of parts of the country. To see what this really feels like and how it's hard to get across how much this has affected Mexico, and it really has, as is stated in this lawsuit, really affected the whole country, its economic growth, its outlook. This has affected everybody. But just to get one very, very quick story, when I covered a horrific massacre, and went to the morgue, and there was people outside, and one of them was a school teacher, a mother who was a school teacher, whose 18-year-old son, a philosophy student, had been dragged away by armed guys with AR-15s, AK-47s, 15 of them in bulletproof jackets, dragged her 18-year-old son, philosophy student, away in front of her, and she spent years trying to find him. Her face, her face just of horror, of tragedy, her life destroyed. So many individual lives. This is one of many, many stories destroyed in this tragedy. Now, for a long time, I looked at this issue of guns coming from the United States to the cartels. All the way back in 2004, I wrote stories about this. For a long time, I thought this was something which, because of the Second Amendment, because of the strength of that, it was like a brick wall, and what was there to really find out about this? But then I realized, talking to gun traffickers in prison in Mexico, there was many, many things there to really discover. And I talked to a gun trafficker in prison in Ciudad Juarez, who described how every weekend he would drive to Dallas to the gun shows and buy 12 to 15 AR-15 rifles with no ID whatsoever. So I realized I dived into this issue of guns, spent the last 4 years really involved in the issue of guns, going all the way to the AK-47 factories in Romania, to the sellers in Texas, to really look at this. And what I've realized is it's tragic, the scale of this. I mean, this is crazy. It's mind-boggling. You know, we really need to shout this out. You know, when you have, you know, in the time that I've been in Mexico, perhaps 4 million guns that have come down. You know, the really thing that's changed, but also the fact that there are things that can be changed with this. That the issue, you know, that people are buying guns is not a question of even challenging the Second Amendment rights necessarily on this. It's just simply saying, how come there's people walking into shops and buying 85 guns in a single purchase? How come people are buying 10 identical AK-47s, which are going to cartels? How come people are buying again and again 50 caliber rifles? And, you know, these are weapons of war. There really are things that can be done, including universal background checks, looking at straw buyers, looking at ghost guns, looking at robbery. There are concrete measures that can be done. And seeing this lawsuit, I think it's a really powerful move by the Mexican government. It really highlights this issue, and it also brings this into the courts. So this also must be discussed in courts and takes this to the gun companies themselves.
Thank you so much, Jan. You really highlighted why we're here. You know, the humanity as well as the scale of this crisis, and how easy it is for people who are carrying out violence to obtain their weapons. So to talk more about the lawsuit that Jan referenced, now we're going to turn to Steve Scheidewin.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me today. I'll start with a disclaimer that this is ongoing litigation, and I'm counsel for the government of Mexico in that case. I'm participating here today in my individual capacity, and the views I express and things I say are my own and not those of the government of Mexico or any of my other clients or any of the other organizations or entities with which I'm affiliated. They may not even be my own views. So that's about as broad a disclaimer as I can give. Jan has done a great job of setting the table with respect to the facts. I'm going to touch on the facts very briefly and talk more about the law and the legal theory of the lawsuit that the government has brought. With respect to the facts, I don't think there's a lot of room for dispute. The following things. Number one, the lawsuit alleges that the gun manufacturers have a policy of selling their guns to any dealer who has a federal license. And they put, the lawsuit alleges they put essentially no discipline or monitoring on their distribution systems to prevent these guns from getting into the hands of the cartels and other criminal organizations. That's the first part of the facts. The second part is there's no doubt that there are, you know, we can dispute exactly how many hundreds of thousands of US source guns make their way into Mexico every year, but there's no doubt that it's a very large number and that it materially contributes to the damage suffered by the government of Mexico. And likewise, there's not going to be any major dispute that the fact that the government itself, let alone its citizens, suffer enormously economic and other harms as a result of this activity. So leave aside those facts. Let's talk about the legal theory of the case. The legal theory of the case is fairly simple. The tort law, the law governing negligence and recovery of damages for negligence, getting injunctions to stop negligence, fundamentally has to do with a balance between the economic interests of, in this case, the gun manufacturers, and the interests of those who are harmed with those products. And each nation is entitled to make its own decision about the balance between the interests of the manufacturers that are within its jurisdiction, and the victims of those products that are within its jurisdiction. So the United States is perfectly entitled to make whatever balance it wants that it thinks is appropriate when both the manufacturer and the victims of those manufacturers and the injuries that they inflict are within the jurisdiction of the United States. That's a domestic U.S. policy decision for the U.S. to make. And the government of Mexico does not dispute that in this lawsuit or otherwise. But the government of Mexico's argument here is that things are different. When the injury, when the misuse of the guns and the injury inflicted by the guns occurs in Mexico, and when the manufacturers who are in the United States foreseeably can see that their products are being routinely shipped into Mexico, then things are different. Then it's the government of Mexico that has not only the right, but the responsibility to weigh the interests of those manufacturers against the interests of the victims that are in Mexico. And therefore, this lawsuit says that it's the government, it's the law, substantive law of Mexico, including its tort law, that applies to the claims that the government asserts in this lawsuit. And this is in international law. This is not a controversial principle. When the injury, where the injury occurs, typically in a transborder tort, it's usually the substantive law of the jurisdiction where the injury occurs that applies. And we will promote that reading of the international law in this lawsuit. And also with respect to the U.S. federal immunity statute, PLACA, we will prove in this lawsuit, intend to prove in this lawsuit, that that statute itself, by its own terms, does not apply to preempt claims or provide immunity for claims when the injury occurs outside of the United States. So that's fundamentally the theory of the lawsuit, that to hit the highlights again, that the manufacturers know, they can foresee that their products are routinely being sent into Mexico. They do nothing essentially to prevent that from happening, that the injury occurs in Mexico, and therefore it's the substantive law of Mexico, including its tort law, which does not provide for immunity for these manufacturers, that applies. Mexico has made in its substantive tort law a different balance than the U.S. has chosen as between the interests of the gun manufacturers and the interests of the victims of those products.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a very clear explication of this lawsuit, and we'll be coming back to you to hear more about that. You talked about how the gun manufacturers know and can foresee that their products will be trafficked and used as they are in Mexico. And to understand a little better about how the firearm manufacturers have marketed and their own strategies, we're going to now turn to Kristen Rand.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this important panel. The Violence Policy Center is looking at this new litigation against the gun industry in the broader context of firearms regulation in the United States. We start with the observation that firearms and ammunition are the only consumer products sold in America that are exempt from federal health and safety regulation. Now, normally the tort system would provide some level of quote unquote regulation, but PLACA, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, bars some types of civil liability. And in what we've seen to date is in the absence of this regulation, the industry has focused almost entirely on manufacturing and marketing military-style firearms, including high-capacity semi-automatic pistols, assault weapons, 50 caliber anti-armor sniper rifles, and accessories that make these guns even more lethal. Things like ultra high capacity magazines, trigger activators, pistol braces, etc. We've also seen that the industry relentlessly focuses on marketing its militarized product using militarized images and language. And they also tout the real or imagined military and law enforcement pedigree of their products. I brought a few slides just to give you a flavor of how the industry uses these images. So Jeff, if you could roll the slides, please. I'm just going to quickly run through some of these examples. This first one is an ad from Fabrique Nationale, and it makes the claim that its assault weapons are born on the battlefront, built for the home front. Next slide, please. This is just a trio of separate ads from a company called Bravo Company Manufacturing, and they just have a whole series of these ads with these military images. Next one, please. Again, this is another image from an FN product catalog. Next, please. They also tout the military and law enforcement pedigree. This is just one example of, again, FN and also Beretta saying, you can have the same gun that the military uses. Next, please. Another example from Sig Sauer, go ahead. That's good. Another example, next please. This is from Daniel Defense, which was one of the guns used in the Las Vegas mass shooting, which there's actually litigation pending in that case that's similar to the Mexican lawsuit. Next, please. A lot of the materials also focus on an undefined mission. That's a very common word used in their advertising. This is one from Armalite. Next, please. This is one from DPMS. And lastly, we have one from SIG for the MCX, which was the gun used in the Pulse mass shooting. Thank you, Jeff. So those are just some examples. So what we see, the bottom line is that anyone can literally build their own army from firearms and accessories that are readily available on the US civilian gun market. And we see organized criminal organizations in Mexico taking advantage of this. And the Violence Policy Center has a project where we look at federal cross-border gun trafficking prosecutions, which show the appetite for Mexican traffickers for these types of weapons. Then domestically, we see mass shooters outfitted like soldiers. The lawsuits, the Mexican suit and others that are pending in the courts are an extremely important step in pulling the industry out of the shadows and exposing their role in driving violence in Mexico, the United States, and other countries. They're also very important in defining the limitations of PLACA. And I'll just end on the note that we must find a way to hold the gun industry accountable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. You really fill in how the gun companies have not only play a role in terms of how they sell weapons, but the marketing and the imaging that they promote plays right into how they're used in Mexico as well as in other types of violence. So let me just say a few words about a related topic, which is the legal exports of firearms by the United States to Mexico. In this case, the lawsuit, focuses on the gun companies. With legal exports, although gun companies play a role because they're profiting, the licensing of those exports is conducted by the US government. In the case of fully automatic firearms. They are licensed currently by the State Department. And there is currently a license application by Sig Sauer, who Kristen just mentioned, for $5.5 million worth of automatic rifles. In fact, the MCX rifles that we just saw. And those rifles are going, are scheduled to go to the Mexican Navy. The Navy has been implicated in a number of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances. They are the security force that is most often charged with torture of detainees. And the State Department, in approving or reviewing this license application, is not making any provision within the license, and neither does Sig Sauer, for where within the Mexican Navy these rifles are going. What unit are they going to? What part of the country are they going to? What, under whose command will they be? So while in the United States, we do have legislation that requires a review, a background check on any kind of violent felony that is committed by the buyer, for these exports, there is no such review. There is only a decision about whether to export these firearms to an overall branch of the government, in this case, the Navy. And so we're very concerned about that particular export. Sig Sauer has a license with the Mexican Navy for up to $265 million worth of firearms exports between now and 2024. And so that's something that we are seeking to have a better review of, both by Congress and by the executive branch. So again, I want to invite folks to, some people have already written questions in the Q&A. I'm going to turn to those now, and I invite others who wish to also to put your questions or comments. They can be directed to specific panelists or to the group as a whole. Or if you have a comment, that's also welcome. So I want to turn first to Johan. You said that the lawsuit is a powerful move, and I want to ask you to say a little bit more about why you think so, based on all of your journalistic reporting and your experience in Mexico. What do you think is this a game changer, and if so, why? Why do you think so?
I think time will still tell if it's a game changer, but I think it's a very solid strategy. I think what we've seen on this issue from the part of the Mexican government and generally kind of attention to the issue, we saw a certain attention to it earlier under the Felipe Calderon administration, when Felipe Calderon did take this to the joint session of Congress back in 2009, I believe that was, 2010. And some pressure then on this issue when it was kind of really the violence was erupting. And then we had this debacle known as Fast and Furious, when American agents were watching guns be trafficked in quite a scandalous way. And one of the worst casualties of Fast and Furious, which was a very bad and botched operation, but one of the worst casualties of Fast and Furious is it kind of threw this issue off the table for a decade. Like, no one in the American administration seemed to want to go near it. No one in Mexico kind of got forgotten about. And in that decade, we've had a huge amount of guns going to Mexico. 250,000 murders in Mexico, the large majority of them with firearms. Horrific stuff that's happened. So it's very good. I think the Mexican government has brought this issue back on the table. And I think the lawsuit, I see two big deals with this. The first is the actual judicial process itself, and that time will tell how much of a game changer that is. But the fact it does coincide with various lawsuits in the United States, and that we have seen big changes in other industries in the United States, like tobacco, like big pharma, often from lawsuits rather than politicians. It could really actually lead to something. I think there's a win or lose. It's about, the gun companies and these various distribution, importing AK-47 companies have to present their case in the court. Could they give some concessions about this and about taking responsibility for things like, they've got knowledge when they're selling a whole bunch of Barrett 50s in Arizona, when they're selling a whole bunch of AK-47s in South Texas, right by the Mexican border, they've got some knowledge about these things and can they take responsibility for that. But the second thing is this has put the issue in the news. The Mexican government, like I say, we're not pressuring the US government over this, but it has put the issue in the news. I've seen more coverage about this issue in the last 2 weeks than I have in some years. And right now, the Biden administration is looking at measures to do with guns. This is going to have at least an impact on their thinking about this. And we hope an impact on actually what they will do in terms of this. And there are concrete things they can do.
Thank you so much, Juan. I totally agree. There's so much more attention to this now than there has been in some ways, although there's been a buildup, there's been more attention, your book, a lot of our project, a lot of other things have been drawing attention. I think this is now building it even more. Yeah, so Steve, there's been a couple questions here kind of asking about the lawsuit and whether it's working on a similar idea as, say, the tobacco lawsuits. Stephen Hargarten has a question here. Is there anything to learn from the tobacco litigation successes? And also asks, this is kind of a similar question, if US car manufacturers make cars without airbags and then ship them to Mexico, could the Mexican government litigate against US manufacturers for that? So I'm wondering if you could sort of speak to, are there parallels here for those two things? Sure,
let me respond even more broadly. So back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there was a series of lawsuits brought by US cities, counties, other governmental units against the gun industry, maybe 30 something of those lawsuits. And there was sort of a spotty record by the plaintiffs as to wins or losses, but there started to be momentum toward the court started to really recognize the legitimacy of those lawsuits, and that was sort of certainly a forerunner of our case in terms of those lawsuits were founded on injuries suffered by the local governments themselves, increased expenses for police, for hospitalization, for ambulance, for social services, all those sorts of injuries, and tying those injuries to the unlawful trafficking of these defendants' guns. And then the gun industry ran to Congress and got PLACA enacted. So that was one set of cases where we had guidance in putting our case together in terms of the facts. Another set of cases is much more current, the opioid litigation in the United States today. The foundation of those cases against Purdue Pharma and other makers of opioids in the United States is quite similar to our allegations. That is, again, the plaintiffs in many of those cases are state and local governments in the United States saying that essentially that industry, the opioid manufacturers, have created a public nuisance and imposed all kinds of additional costs upon governmental bodies. And so we have been guided in our construction of our case by those lawsuits as well, where the courts have pretty uniformly now come around to the idea that manufacturers, including the drug manufacturers in the United States, and we say the gun industry in the United States, have an obligation, just as any other citizens or residents, to not take unreasonable conduct that injures another. And that means that in the case of the opioids, those manufacturers are required to monitor and discipline their distribution systems, their drug wholesalers, all the way down to the Walgreens and the CVSs of the world, that the manufacturers of those drugs have an obligation under tort law to monitor and discipline their distribution systems to see that their products that they put into commerce are not causing harm. And the courts have said there's a proximate causation there, that the the city and county governments in the United States were able, in a way that the law recognizes, to trace their injuries back through the chain of distribution to the manufacturers. And we think that we're going to, we are hopeful, and we think we will be able to prove a similar causal chain here, that to trace our injury back to the gun manufacturers. In terms of the specific question that was asked about would the law of Mexico apply to car manufacturers that did not have adequate airbags that they were knowingly shipping into Mexico? And I certainly believe that under international law, in those instances, that the courts may well conclude that it's the tort law of Mexico that would apply there. And yet it's not hard to conceive of why. Think about some steel plant that's in Pennsylvania, and it's discharging pollutants into streams that flow down into, let's say, West Virginia. Would anybody think it's out of order for those who are injured by the pollutants in West Virginia to say, hey, wait a minute, even if the law of Pennsylvania says you can discharge these pollutants into the stream, you know that stream is carrying these pollutants downstream into West Virginia. No one would be at all surprised to say that, hey, wait a minute, the steel company in Pennsylvania, you have to organize your affairs in such a way that you comply not only with the laws of Pennsylvania, but also with those of West Virginia, where you know your pollutants are being discharged and are causing harm. So it's no different here, the fact that it's a national boundary rather than a US state boundary. When you knowingly send your products into a jurisdiction and cause harm there in a systematic and knowing way, you've got to comply with that jurisdiction's laws, and you can't be surprised or complain about it when that law gets applied to you.
Right. So if I could follow up really quickly, Steve, there's a couple questions that are very similar around what is the responsibility of the gun companies? And your mention of Purdue Pharma reminds me of this film that showed that a lot of the Purdue Pharma marketing salespeople knew that the distributors, which drugstores were actually promoting addiction, and you know, trying, and which doctors, you know, who were running the pill mills, right? And they particularly marketed to them. There's a question here around whether the claim is that the gun companies have a responsibility to vet the licensed firearm dealers. And there's a similar question that says, what would the gun manufacturers need to do in response to the lawsuit to not be vulnerable to such litigation? Or like, how would they need to behave to be exercising a legally level of responsibility? If you could briefly respond to that.
Yeah, those things are sorts of questions that'll be hashed out in the details of this litigation. I don't want to address them in any detail, but at a high level, I will say that, for example, these manufacturers have access to, the lawsuit alleges that these manufacturers have access to real-time sales data, where, for example, they would be able to determine if they put the systems in place, and we hope that our lawsuit will give them a financial incentive to put such systems in place in the future, that they would have access to real-time sales data that would indicate, hey, John Smith down in El Paso bought 3 AK-47s in a particular gun store on Monday, and here he is again on Tuesday buying 5 more at a different gun store in El Paso. And by golly, there he is on Wednesday buying 6 more at a third gun store. It's the manufacturers who have access to and could build the system that would allow them to have visibility into the fact that that's happening. Beyond that, I think the lawsuit alleges, and we think it's a fact, that it's a relatively small number of problem gun dealers who are involved in trafficking the majority of these guns into Mexico. And the manufacturers have at their fingertips that information as to who those problematic gun dealers are. And it's, to put it bluntly, it's the absence of U.S. tort law being applied to these manufacturers that has allowed this situation to develop. You don't have this kind of a repeat problem with products in the United States in far less dangerous products, because there's tort law that governs it, that gives the manufacturers an incentive to be reasonable, to be cautious, to monitor and discipline their distribution systems. And that's lacking, frankly, because of PLACA in the United States. Well, PLACA doesn't apply to our claim. And so the tort law of Mexico is going to be applied here and give these manufacturers a financial incentive to get on the right side of this issue, to become part of the solution instead of the problem.
Thank you, Steve. I think we may be coming back to PLACA in just a moment. Kristen, you showed us very vividly how the gun companies are marketing. And there's a couple of questions here about how that marketing may apply specifically to people in Mexico. I believe the lawsuit references a particular Colt pistol or revolver that has a Emiliano Zapata's image embossed on it. There's also a question about whether any of the advertising that you showed is in Spanish. Like, to what extent are the gun companies directing or marketing to a Spanish-speaking audience, and or directly to people in Mexico or Mexico identified?
Well, that's an interesting question. We actually recently did a study on how the gun lobby is more actively marketing its products to minorities in the United States, including Latinos, and is trying to reach out to build their customer base. But I think, from the standpoint of how they're marketing their guns in these militarized, with these militarized images and language, they know what's going on in Mexico, and they know what's going on in the Caribbean, for example, where, most of the gun violence there is traceable to US source guns. So they know there are entities who are really building their own armies from weapons acquired in the United States, and they are feeding that by marketing these guns with these hyper militarized images and saying, hey, the organized criminal organizations in Mexico, you can have the same guns as the US military, and in some cases the exact same firepower, like the Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle. So they know what's going on, and they're being negligent, we would argue, by using this sort of imagery that only helps feed the appetite for these kinds of guns in Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, you make a really important point, Kristen, that it's not just whether it's directed to a Spanish-speaking audience. It's the military, highlighting of the military aspects of these weapons, which appeals directly to organizations that are contesting territory. I think Ian has written about this as well, right? That the criminal organizations in Mexico, if they can control territory, then they can control the economic activity, legal and illegal, in that territory. And for that, they want these military type weapons that are being marketed exactly that way and in the way that you showed. There's also a couple questions here about the legal exports. My friend Carlos Perez Ricard asks, if there's any insight on why Sig Sauer is not named in this lawsuit, Steve might have some comment on that. I can say something. And then there's also a question about what kind of legislation, U.S. legislation, there may be in the works or that is proposed in order to control to apply the kind of background check principle for legal firearms exports. And my response about Sig Sauer is that when you look at the firearms that are recovered from crime scenes in Mexico, the #1 make of all firearms recovered at crime scenes is Colt. So Colt is very popular. Most of these are handguns. There are also many long guns. A very high percentage of those recovered guns would qualify as assault weapons under California law. And Sig Sauer is, in fact, there's not very many of them in those that are recovered in those crime scenes. So that's, I think, from my perspective, that's probably one of the main reasons probably why it's not named, is because it's not one of the primary makes of firearms that are recovered and demonstrably used in criminal violence in Mexico. Now, that said, there is important a need for applying end-use controls for legally exported firearms, including Sig Sauer firearms. There's legislation that's been introduced by Representative Ilhan Omar that would apply a very strong human rights filter for all arms exports to all countries, and to not just to firearms, but other types of arms. A much stronger filter than is applied right now. Because as it stands now, unless a country is essentially embargoed, like Burma or Myanmar or North Korea, then the firearms are essentially, there's not much of a filter on that in terms of statutory law. So having some kind of legislation for that is really important. At the same time, there are things that both the Congress and executive branch can do to stop specific sales, like this one slated for the Mexican Navy, as well as systematize more end-use controls for all firearms exports. Some of this could be done by transferring back to the State Department oversight of all firearms exports from the Commerce Department, and some of it could be done by implementing more end-use controls. So I want to ask something. We've got a few more minutes left. There's a kind of a general question here, which I think is an important one for everyone here, which is what gun violence prevention activists should be pursuing like if the lawsuit, for example, provides an opportunity for shifting the legislation, as Jan and others have suggested, what are some of the things that people should be focusing on? And since President Biden has said publicly that PLACA, which is armors the gun companies against lawsuits for violence committed within the United States, with some limitations on that. What are some strategies or suggestions or allies that you all suggest in terms of changing legislation at that federal level? And so I open that up to anyone on the panel here.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, you go ahead, please, Kristen.
Well, I was just going to say there's a multitude of national organizations working on a variety of gun violence prevention measures. Giffords, Brady, Everytown, Violence Policy Center, and there are also a multitude of state-based groups. So if you want to get involved and be active on the issue, you can get in touch with your local group or one of these national groups and look at their agenda. But I think, top of the mind is passing a universal background check, because that provides the foundation for adequately regulating firearms commerce in the United States. But I think, from the Violence Policy Center's perspective, we really have to get the gun industry out of in control. They have been out of control for the last couple of decades. And we're seeing, for example, the Biden administration taking some steps, minor but important, like regulating ghost guns, which ghost guns actually are an existential threat to the integrity of our gun laws. And if you want to do something today, you can comment on the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives rule that's going to regulate, that's proposed to regulate ghost guns. You can go just look up ghost gun rule, and you can submit a comment. The comments are actually due tomorrow. And then also the Biden administration is taking steps to regulate pistol braces, which is exploiting a law to allow this basically what are in essence short-barreled rifles without, it's kind of complicated. But there's a myriad of examples of how the industry is out of control, and we need a robust ATF to begin to rein them in. So those would be the two observations I would make.
Thanks, Kristen. Go ahead, John.
Sure, yeah, I agree with Kristen. I think there's four main measures that the guns go from the main legal retail market to the black market and to be trafficked to Mexico. And that is using the private sale loophole, using straw buyers, sometimes of theft of gun stores, and sometimes the issue of ghost guns. So I think these four things, there's four measures you can take. I think it is important to confront all of them, because if they just attack one thing, they shift to something else. So like if you're just, hitting straw buyers and so forth, they'll make more ghost guns. But there is measures already on the table. So universal background checks, I think, is very important for trafficking to Mexico. The issue of straw buyers, there's various ways to approach this. So people paid money with clean records, paid money to buy guns, responsible for a huge amount of trafficking. Now there's the issue of, you can either try and pass a federal firearms trafficking law, which there isn't. I mean, right now they arrest them for lying on the form. There's a debate where you can increase recommended sentences, because right now people who are even buying things like 10 AK-47s in one go for the cartel are getting probation. And there's things like extended background checks, like just say, if somebody walks in and wants to buy a Barrett 50 for $15,000, who are they, and really can they, are they a legitimate person to want this, or are they connected to car, some suspicious things there. And then, the ghost guns, again, there's legislation there about this, and there's legislation about theft, about people saying they have to at least lock guns in locked cabinets, which, right now they can leave them in open cabinets. So all these measures can be approached. And if I could quickly, for the last comment, just to address quickly Cecilia Oliveira from Brazil, who asked about how this affects, how this, South America, which is Brazil's receiving a huge amount of guns, Central American countries, other countries. I think the same measures that are used in the use of trafficking to Mexico are also used to Central America, South America. So the same, measures are there, and to trafficking within the United States. Would be interesting, I think, if other governments across Latin America, I don't know if the Mexican Foreign Secretary looked at approaching other governments, if there was like joint action between various countries over this, or at least joint pressures, that might, even move the dial.
Yeah, so that's thank you so much, John. There's a question here about what specific end-use controls for the legal exports can the U.S. government, because there's something, the State Department has something called the Blue Lantern program. Now, those are mostly checks on firearms after they've been exported, not before they've been licensed. And they're the very small percentage of things that are actually checked, and generally they just check to see, okay, are the firearms where they say they are, not whether the end users are committing human rights abuses or colluding with organized crime. So in the case of Mexico, the first step is to actually identify the end users, because right now the licenses don't identify the end users. Even the end use certificates only identify, for police who are end users, they only identify the Mexican army, which is distributing those weapons to the police. So that's the first thing. But then also to embrace, for the State Department and Commerce Department, to embrace actual commitment to controls for excluding end users that have been implicated in human rights crimes or colluding with organized crime. There's also a question here, which others may have some thoughts on, and then I want to turn to Steve for one other thing before we close, about key gaps in knowledge that have been identified on this during the lawsuit, during the preparation of the lawsuit. And I know from the research that we've done that there's not a lot of, for example, there's not a lot of information on what are the circumstances in which firearms that are recovered by Mexican military or police agencies, how were they recovered? What were the circumstances? Was there some kind of active intelligence in advance, or was it basically a passive operation? I think the same is very true on the US side. We know that there are very few institutional incentives for US agencies to go after firearms and firearms traffickers, but understanding where they are recovering firearms, how did that come about? What were the circumstances in which that came about, I think is from my perspective, is one of the gaps. Before we close, I just want to turn to Steve one last time. And that is, there's a question here about how long the lawsuit might last, whether Mexican individual citizens who have been harmed by firearms might also have standings. So I'm wondering if you can briefly address those before we close.
Well, this is a major commercial litigation, and litigations of this type in the United States take years, frankly. So a time frame of 3-4 years, even longer, is not out of the question. I do suspect that the question of the applicability or not of PLACA will be litigated, fairly soon in the litigation. Soon being a relative term, it will be one of the first things that happens, I suspect. And so there would be at least an initial ruling on that, and then whoever loses that may try to go up on appeal while the rest of the case is pending. So it gets complicated and takes a long time. It's not going to be a quick fix, but the government of Mexico is in this for however long it takes. They are absolutely committed to this litigation, and we'll see it through. What was the second part of your question, John? About how long, and what was the second part?
Whether individual citizens would have standing.
Yeah. This litigation is brought on behalf of the government of Mexico as an entity in and of itself for the injuries that it has sustained. And the government made an advertent decision to bring it that way, to give the litigation the kind of heft that is needed to sustain a case of this nature. They have the resources to do it. Whether other individuals in Mexico will, in the wake of this litigation, take advantage of the favorable rulings that we hope to get, that remains to be seen. But this litigation is on behalf of the government as an entity.
Thanks so much. So we're going to make some final comments, if any kind of parting words that you may have. Kristen, first you.
I just want to say, and particularly to Steve, that these new lawsuits are just so exciting for those of us who've worked on this issue for a very long time. I was there when they passed PLACA, and I'm so happy to see brave people like Steve and other lawyers taking on these cases to help define PLACA and create meaningful exceptions. So reading the complaint in the Mexico suit was just a joy for me. to see all the information pulled together about how the industry really operates and how they should be held accountable. So I think I might probably speak on behalf of all gun violence prevention advocates that we're just super excited to see these lawsuits move forward.
Yes, thank you. Johan, final words?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the interesting phrases in the lawsuits is it talks about the iron river of guns coming down. It says, this is not a natural force. It uses that something like that language. It's a very interesting phrase. I think it's very important. It's not natural. I think one of the things with this issue is like, people say, well, this just happens. You know, there happens to be a couple of 100,000 firearms flowing south every year, going to these very violent cartels, committing mass murder. That it kind of can't be stopped, and this kind of attitude of, you know, we have to just live with the violence. You know, it's not normal and natural. When you see, right, you know, like these numbers, and you know, the 50 most murderous cities, and so many of them in Mexico, and done with these firearms in Tijuana and Guanajuato and Michoacán and Guerrero and Tamaulipas, year after year, this just crazy body count, the way this affects the whole of society. And you know, there's one argument that, well, if they don't buy guns in the United States, they'll buy them from China. I don't buy that. First, the United States has a responsibility for this historic case of gun trafficking to a very, very violent situation. But also it's the abundance of firearms. If they were coming from much further away, they wouldn't be as cheap as abundant. There's just so many firearms that leads to the level of violence. So I really hope in the years to come, this situation can be changed.
Thank you so much, Johan. Steve?
I'll end things where Ian began them, and where he's circled back to here at the end. This case, especially from my perspective, and you heard me talk over and over about the law, that's sort of a dry, almost boring aspect to it. But it's really important to remember that behind all this are individual families that are torn apart by this violence in Mexico. And it's just absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. This is no way to run a society, either on the US side of the border, or accepting the way it has been accepted up until now, the unbelievable injury and harm that is caused in Mexico. So we're going to do everything we can within the confines of a lawsuit to help bring an end to it. Obviously, on the political front, the organizations that have been toiling in these fields for decades have got to keep at it. We have to hope that more people will join. And I applaud those organizations, and I applaud especially the Brady Center, whose lawyers are co-counsel with me in this litigation. But it's time to put a stake in the ground and say, we're making a stand right here. It's going to be a new day. And we'll do everything we can to put a dent into this problem.
Thank you so much, Steve. This lawsuit, from my perspective, has been really important in helping all of us see the lives of Mexicans, Mexican families, victims, communities, people all over the country, not just near the border, impacted over many years and by many different types of gun violence, and to see those lives as important as the lives of people within the United States who are impacted by gun violence or by other things, and impacted by the pandemic, and impacted by injustice. And to me, this lawsuit is really key in helping us to come together to address this issue that impacts people without any recognition of borders or nationality. So I want to thank so much our panelists, Johan Griel, Stephen Shadow, and Kristen Rand. Thank you to the Network for the Prevention of Gun Violence in the Americas, Forum on the Arms Trade, the Giffords Center, and Global Exchange. And thank all of you who have participated and been here with us. You will receive a follow-up email in which you can give us more feedback, as well as you'll see some links to a recording of this particular webinar and how to get more information. Thank you so much, and be well. Take care of yourselves.